Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the July 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of The State, a lecture delivered at the Sverdlov University by Lenin in 1919. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this speech was first delivered on July 11, 1919. It was first published in Pravda number 15, January 18, 1929. The source is Lenin's Collected Works, 4th English edition, Progress Publishers, Moscow, 1972, volume 29. Translated by George Hanna, HTML markup and transcription by John Muller, David Walters, and Robert Cimbala. Second proofreading by David Walters, 2009. And it's in the Lenin Internet Archive at Marxists.org, the Marxists Internet Archive. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So just a comment before we begin. This piece is called The State, not to be confused with The State and Revolution, also by Lenin. However, the two works do cover a lot of the same topics, and if you like this, I would definitely recommend also listening to or reading The State and Revolution. These works are important for becoming familiar with the Marxist understanding of the state as a product of class society, as a mechanism for one class suppressing another, and the differences between a workers' state and a bourgeois or capitalist state or any other type of state from an earlier period of class society. Here at Socialism for All, we've talked about this topic quite a bit, and I think that it's an important one to digest for the US left and for the left of other similar countries, where there are many anarchists and also social democrats, both of whom Marxists would say have a fundamental misunderstanding of the role and function of the state, particularly with regard to socialist revolution and that sort of social change. Anarchists, from the Marxist point of view, make the error that the state simply needs to be abolished at the start of the revolution and then not replaced with anything, that just suddenly you have anarchy. And social democrats tend to make the mistake of not abolishing the state, but just sort of, keeping the capitalist state there, but reforming it so that it is more pleasant. From the Marxist point of view, both of these are incorrect. In a nutshell, the Marxist approach to the state is that every class, when it comes to power, so, for instance, the capitalists came to power during the feudal era and then abolished feudalism. When they did this, they set up a capitalist state to replace the vanquished and discarded feudal state, which had been a mechanism for a number of centuries for enforcing feudalism, the class interests of the ruling class of feudalism, monarchies, and so forth. And then that capitalist state, once it was built up and in place firmly, has served the purpose of, and is serving the purpose of, still in most countries in the world today, enforcing the class rule of the bourgeoisie or capitalists. So, who then, if the capitalists were the revolutionary class under feudalism, who are the revolutionary class under capitalism? Well, that would be the proletariat, or working class as we are commonly called. When we rise to power and abolish capitalism, we will not keep the capitalist state. Instead, we will set up a new type of state in its place to enforce the class rule of the proletariat during the transition period of proletarianizing the rest of society. Capitalism proletarianizes most of the population, but it still leaves, obviously, the bourgeoisie. They're not going to proletarianize themselves completely, although many bourgeois do get ruined in that process and fall either into the petty bourgeoisie or into the proletariat. But the proletariat will complete proletarianization, proletarianize the bourgeoisie and all other lingering classes until there is only one class, the proletariat. In other words, class society will have been abolished entirely, because if you have one class, there are no class distinctions. Everyone has the same relationship to the means of production, and it is completing this that is the purpose of the proletarian state. So the SOCDEMs are wrong that the capitalist state will be kept around, and the anarchists are wrong that the capitalist state will not be replaced with anything. There is, in fact, a transitional period. On the day of the revolution, there is a quantum leap in terms of what the proletarian state can accomplish in terms of changing rights and abolishing classes, but it can't be done all at once. That is the purpose of the proletarian state during the transitional period. Marxists do theorize that eventually even the proletarian state will, quote, wither away, as the famous quotation goes. But this is following the process of the elimination of classes, which is the purpose of the proletarian state, i.e. to defend the revolution and suppress the bourgeoisie and other enemies of socialist construction during the building process. But this process takes decades, and it is the purpose of the proletarian state to provide that order and defense during that time, remembering, of course, that the enemies of socialism are not just inside the country, but they're international. So you have to defend both against the internal elements, which are going to try to sabotage and oppose the constructing of socialism. They're going to try to do a counter-revolution and revert back to capitalism. And then, of course, the international imperial elements that are going to try to do the same. Eventually, after classes have been abolished and there is not a threat of counter-revolution, class society is thereby ended, and the state is theorized to turn its attention from managing people, or in other words, suppressing classes, to just simply administrating the things in the economy, keeping industry running, coordinating and executing the economic plans, etc. So, with that introduction out of the way, let's get into the lecture. Comrades, according to the plan you have adopted, and which has been conveyed to me, the subject of today's talk is the state. I do not know how familiar you are already with the subject. If I am not mistaken, your courses have only just begun, and this is the first time you will be tackling the subject systematically. If that is so, then it may very well happen that in the first lecture on this difficult subject, I may not succeed in making my exposition sufficiently clear and comprehensible to many of my listeners. And if this should prove to be the case, I would request that you not be perturbed by this fact, because the question of the state is a most complex and difficult one, perhaps one that, more than any other, has been confused by bourgeois scholars, writers, and philosophers. It should not therefore be expected that a thorough understanding of this subject can be obtained from one brief talk at a first sitting. After the first talk on this subject, you should make a note of the passages which you have not understood or which are not clear to you, and return to them a second, a third, and a fourth time, so that what you have not understood may be further supplemented and elucidated later, both by reading and by various lectures and talks. I hope that we may manage to meet once again, and that we shall then be able to exchange opinions on all supplementary questions and see what has remained most unclear. I also hope that in addition to talks and lectures, you will devote some time to reading at least a few of the most important works of Marx and Engels. I have no doubt that these most important works are to be found in the list of books and in the handbooks which are available in your library for the students of the Soviet and Party School. And although, again, some of you may at first be dismayed by the difficulty of the exposition, I must again warn you that you should not let this worry you. What is unclear at a first reading will become clear at a second reading, or when you subsequently approach the question from a somewhat different angle. For I once more repeat that the question is so complex and has been so confused by bourgeois scholars and writers that anybody who desires to study it seriously and master it independently must attack it several times, return to it again and again, and consider it from various angles in order to attain a clear, sound understanding of it. Because it is such a fundamental, such a basic question in all politics, and because not only in such stormy and revolutionary times as the present, but even in the most peaceful times, you will come across it every day in any newspaper in connection with any economic or political question, it will be all the easier to return to it. Every day, in one context or another, you will be returning to this question. What is the state? What is its nature? What is its significance? And what is the attitude of our party, the party that is fighting for the overthrow of capitalism, the Communist Party? What is its attitude to the state? And the chief thing is that you should acquire, as a result of your reading, as a result of the talks and lectures you will hear on the state, the ability to approach this question independently, since you will be meeting with it on the most diverse occasions, in connection with the most trifling questions, in the most unexpected contexts, and in discussions and disputes with opponents. Only when you learn to find your way about independently in this question may you consider yourself sufficiently confirmed in your convictions and able with sufficient success to defend them against anybody at any time. After these brief remarks, I shall proceed to deal with the question itself. What is the state? How did it arise? And fundamentally, what attitude to the state should be displayed by the party of the working class, which is fighting for the complete overthrow of capitalism, the Communist Party. I have already said that you are not likely to find another question which has been so confused, deliberately and unwittingly, by representatives of bourgeois science, philosophy, jurisprudence, political economy, and journalism, as the question of the state. To this day, it is very often confused with religious questions, not only those professing religious doctrines, it is quite natural to expect it of them, but even people who consider themselves free from religious prejudice very often confuse the specific question of the state with questions of religion and endeavor to build up a doctrine, very often a complex one, with an ideological, philosophical approach and argumentation which claims that the state is something divine, something supernatural, that it is a certain force by virtue of which mankind has lived, that it is a force of divine origin which confers on people or can confer on people, or which brings with it something that is not of man, but is given to us from without. And it must be said that this doctrine is so closely bound up with the interests of the exploiting class, the landowners and the capitalists, so serves their interests, has so deeply permeated all the customs, views, and science of the gentlemen who represent the bourgeoisie, that you will meet with vestiges of it on every hand, even in the view of the state held by the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. In today's terms, these would be Radlibs, Socdems, and populists. Although they are convinced that they can regard the state with sober eyes and reject indignantly the suggestion that they are under the sway of religious prejudices. This question has been so confused and complicated because it affects the interests of the ruling classes more than any other question, yielding place in this respect only to the foundations of economic science. The doctrine of the state serves to justify social privilege, the existence of exploitation, the existence of capitalism, and that is why it would be the greatest mistake to expect impartiality on this question, to approach it in the belief that people who claim to be scientific can give you a purely scientific view on the subject. In the question of the state, in the doctrine of the state, in the theory of the state, when you have become familiar with it and have gone into it deeply enough, you will always discern the struggle between different classes, a struggle which is reflected or expressed in a conflict of views on the state, in the estimate of the role and significance of the state. Quick comment here, I just want to highlight this sentence. I'm going to read it again. In the question of the state, in the doctrine of the state, in the theory of the state, when you have become familiar with it and have gone into it deeply enough, you will always discern the struggle between different classes, a struggle which is reflected or expressed in a conflict of views on the state, in the estimate of the role and significance of the state. In other words, when somebody is preaching a certain view on the state, it is a reflection of their position in the class struggle, or at least whatever class ideology they have picked up. You may not get this at first, but stick that in your mind and come back to it. Continuing. To approach this question as scientifically as possible, we must cast at least a fleeting glance back on the history of the state, its emergence and development. The most reliable thing in a question of social science, and one that is most necessary in order really to acquire the habit of approaching this question correctly, and not allowing oneself to get lost in the massive detail or in the immense variety of conflicting opinion. The most important thing, if one is to approach this question scientifically, is not to forget the underlying historical connection, to examine every question from the standpoint of how the given phenomenon arose in history, and what were the principal stages in its development, and, from the standpoint of its development, to examine what it has become today. I hope that in studying this question of the state, you will acquaint yourselves with Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. This is one of the fundamental works of modern socialism, every sentence of which can be accepted with confidence, in the assurance that it has not been said at random, but is based on immense historical and political material. Undoubtedly, not all the parts of this work have been expounded in an equally popular and comprehensible way. Some of them presume a reader who already possesses a certain knowledge of history and economics. But I again repeat that you should not be perturbed if on reading this work You do not understand it all at once. Very few people do. But returning to it later, when your interest has been aroused, you will succeed in understanding the greater part, if not the whole of it. I referred to this book because it gives the correct approach to the question in the sense mentioned. It begins with a historical sketch of the origin of the state. This question, like every other, for example, that of the origin of capitalism, the exploitation of humans by humans, socialism, how socialism arose, what conditions gave rise to it, can be approached soundly and confidently only if we cast a glance back on the history of its development as a whole. In connection with this problem, it should first of all be noted that the state has not always existed. There was a time when there was no state. It appears wherever and whenever a division of society into classes appears, whenever exploiters and exploited appear. Before the first form of exploitation of humans by humans arose, the first form of division into classes, slave owners and slaves, there existed the patriarchal family, or, as it is sometimes called, the clan family, clan tribe. At the time, people of one kin lived together. Fairly definite traces of these primitive times have survived in the life of many primitive peoples, and if you take any work whatsoever on primitive civilization, you will always come across more or less definite descriptions, indications, and recollections of the fact that there was a time, more or less similar to primitive communism, when the division of society into slave owners and slaves did not yet exist. And in those times there was no state, no special apparatus for the systematic application of force and the subjugation of people by force. It is such an apparatus that is called the state. In primitive society, when people lived in small family groups and were still at the lowest stages of development, in a condition approximating to savagery, an epoch from which modern, civilized human society is separated by several thousand years, there were yet no signs of the existence of a state. We find the predominance of custom, authority, respect, the power enjoyed by the elders of the clan. We find this power sometimes accorded to women. The position of women then was not like the downtrodden and oppressed condition of women today. But nowhere do we find a special category of people set apart to rule others, and who, for the sake and purpose of rule, systematically and permanently have at their disposal a certain apparatus of coercion, an apparatus of violence, such as is represented at the present time, as you all realize, by armed contingents of troops, prisons, and other means of subjugating the will of others by force, all that which constitutes the essence of the state. If we get away from what are known as religious teachings, from the subtleties, philosophical arguments, and various opinions advanced by bourgeois scholars, if we get away from these and try to get at the real core of the matter, we shall find that the state really does amount to such an apparatus of rule which stands outside society as a whole. When there appears such a special group of people solely occupied with government, and who, in order to rule, need a special apparatus of coercion to subjugate the will of others by force, prisons, special contingents of people, armies, etc., then there appears the state. But there was a time when there was no state, when general ties, the community itself, discipline, and the ordering of work were maintained by force of custom and tradition, by the authority or the respect enjoyed by the elders of the clan or by women, who in those times not only frequently enjoyed a status equal to that of men, but not infrequently enjoyed an even higher status, and when there was no special category of persons who were specialists in ruling. History shows that the state, as a special apparatus for coercing people, arose wherever and whenever there appeared a division of society into classes, that is, a division into groups of people, some of which were permanently in a position to appropriate the labor of others, where some people exploited others. And this division of society into classes must always be clearly borne in mind as a fundamental fact of history. The development of all human societies for thousands of years, in all countries without exception, reveals a general conformity to law, a regularity and consistency, so that at first we had a society without classes, the original patriarchal, primitive society, in which there were no aristocrats. Then we had a society based on slavery, a slave-owning society. The whole of modern, civilized Europe has passed through this stage. Slavery ruled supreme 2,000 years ago. The vast majority of peoples of the other parts of the world also passed through this stage. Traces of slavery survive to this day among the less developed peoples. You will find the institution of slavery in Africa, for example, at the present time. The division into slave owners and slaves was the first important class division. The former group not only owned all the means of production, the land and the implements, however poor and primitive they may have been in those times, but they also owned people. This group was known as slave owners, while those who labored and supplied labor for others were known as slaves. This form was followed in history by another, feudalism. In the great majority of countries, slavery in the course of its development evolved into serfdom. The fundamental division of society was now into feudal lords and peasant serfs. The form of relations between people changed. The slave owners had regarded the slaves as their property. The law had confirmed this view and regarded the slave as a chattel, completely owned by the slave owner. As far as the peasant serf was concerned, class oppression and dependence remained, but it was not considered that the feudal lord owned the peasants as chattels, as property, but that he was only entitled to their labor, to the obligatory performance of certain services. In practice, as you know, serfdom, especially in Russia, where it survived longest of all and assumed the crudest forms, in no way differed from slavery. Further, with the development of trade, the appearance of the world market, and the development of money circulation, a new class arose within feudal society, the capitalist class. From the commodity, the exchange of commodities, and the rise of the power of money, there derived the power of capital. During the 18th century, or rather from the end of the 18th century and during the 19th century, revolutions took place all over the world. Feudalism was abolished in all the countries of Western Europe. Russia was the last country in which this took place. In 1861, a radical change took place in Russia as well. As a consequence of this, one form of society was replaced by another. Feudalism was replaced by capitalism, under which division into classes remained, as well as various traces and remnants of serfdom. But fundamentally, the division into classes assumed a different form. The owners of capital, the owners of the land, and the owners of the factories in all capitalist countries constituted, and still constitute, an insignificant minority of the population, who have complete command of the labor of the whole people, and consequently command, oppress, and exploit the whole mass of laborers, the majority of whom are proletarians, wage workers, who procure their livelihood in the process of production only by the sale of their own workers' hands, their labor power. With the transition to capitalism, the peasants, who had been disunited and downtrodden in feudal times, were converted partly, the majority of them, into proletarians, and partly, the minority, into wealthy peasants, who themselves hired laborers, and who constituted a rural bourgeoisie. This fundamental fact, the transition of society from primitive forms of slavery to serfdom, and finally to capitalism, you must always bear in mind, for only by remembering this fundamental fact, only by examining all political doctrines placed in this fundamental scheme, will you be able properly to appraise these doctrines and understand what they refer to. For each of these great periods in the history of humanity, slave-owning, feudal, and capitalist, embraces scores and hundreds of centuries and presents such a mass of political forms, such a variety of political doctrines, opinions, and revolutions, that this extreme diversity and immense variety, especially in connection with the political, philosophical, and other doctrines of bourgeois scholars and politicians, can be understood only by firmly holding, as to a guiding thread, to this division of society into classes, this change in the forms of class rule, and from this standpoint examining all social questions, economic, political, spiritual, religious, etc. If you examine the state from the standpoint of this fundamental division, you will find that before the division of society into classes, as I have already said, no state existed. But as the social division into classes arose and took firm root, as class society arose, the state also arose and took firm root. The history of humanity knows scores and hundreds of countries that have passed or are still passing through slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. In each of these countries, despite the immense historical changes that have taken place, despite all the political vicissitudes and all the revolutions due to this development of humanity, to the transition from slavery through feudalism to capitalism, and to the present worldwide struggle against capitalism, you will always discern the emergence of the state. It has always been a certain apparatus which stood outside society and consisted of a group of people engaged solely, or almost solely, or mainly in ruling. People are divided into the ruled and into specialists in ruling, those who rise above society and are called rulers, statesmen. This apparatus, this group of people who rule others, always possesses certain means of coercion, of physical force, irrespective of whether this violence over people is expressed in the primitive club or in more perfected types of weapons in the epoch of slavery, or in the firearms which appeared in the Middle Ages, or finally in modern weapons, which in the 20th century are technical marvels and are based entirely on the latest achievements of modern technology. The methods of violence changed, but whenever there was a state, there existed in every society a group of persons who ruled, who commanded, who dominated, and who, in order to maintain their power, possessed an apparatus of physical coercion, an apparatus of violence, with those weapons which corresponded to the technical level of the given epoch. And by examining these general phenomena, by asking ourselves why no state existed when there were no classes, when there were no exploiters and exploited, and why it appeared when classes appeared, only in this way shall we find a definite answer to the question of what is the nature and significance of the state. The state is a machine for maintaining the rule of one class over another. When there were no classes in society, when, before the epoch of slavery, people labored in primitive conditions of greater equality, in conditions when the productivity of labor was still at its lowest, and when primitive people could barely procure the wherewithal for the crudest and most primitive existence, a special group of people, whose function is to rule and to dominate the rest of society, had not and could not yet have emerged. Only when the first form of the division of society into classes appeared, only when slavery appeared, when a certain class of people, by concentrating on the crudest forms of agricultural labor, could produce a certain surplus, when this surplus was not absolutely essential for the most wretched existence of the slave, and passed into the hands of the slave owner, when in this way the existence of this class of slave owners was secure, then, in order that it might take firm root, it was necessary for a state to appear. And it did appear. The slave-owning state, an apparatus which gave the slave owners power and enabled them to rule over the slaves. Both society and the state were then on a much smaller scale than they are now. They possessed incomparably poorer means of communication. The modern means of communication did not then exist. Mountains, rivers, and seas were immeasurably greater obstacles than they are now, and the state took shape within far narrower geographical boundaries. A technically weak state apparatus served a state confined within relatively narrow boundaries and within a narrow range of action. Nevertheless, there did exist an apparatus which compelled the slaves to remain in slavery, which kept one part of society subjugated to and oppressed by another. It is impossible to compel the greater part of society to work systematically for the other part of society without a permanent apparatus of coercion. So long as there were no classes, there was no apparatus of this sort. When classes appeared, everywhere and always, as the division grew and took firmer hold, there also appeared a special institution, the state. The forms of state were extremely varied. As early as the period of slavery, we find diverse forms of the state in the countries that were the most advanced, cultured, and civilized according to the standards of the time. For example, in ancient Greece and Rome, which were based entirely on slavery. At that time, there was already a difference between monarchy and republic, between aristocracy and democracy. A monarchy is the power of a single person. A republic is the absence of any non-elected authority. An aristocracy is the power of a relatively small minority. A democracy is the power of the people. Democracy in Greek literally means the power of the people. All these differences arose in the epoch of slavery. Despite these differences, the state of the slave-owning epoch was a slave-owning state, irrespective of whether it was a monarchy or a republic, aristocratic or democratic. In every course on the history of ancient times, in any lecture on this subject, you will hear about the struggle which was waged between the monarchical and republican states. But the fundamental fact is that the slaves were not regarded as human beings. Not only were they not regarded as citizens, they were not even regarded as human beings. Roman law regarded them as chattels, property. The law of manslaughter, not to mention the other laws for the protection of the person, did not extend to slaves. It defended only the slave owners, who were alone recognized as citizens with full rights. But whether a monarchy was instituted or a republic, it was a monarchy of the slave owners or a republic of the slave owners. All rights were enjoyed by the slave owners, while the slave was a chattel in the eyes of the law. And not only could any sort of violence be perpetrated against a slave, but even the killing of a slave was not considered a crime. Slave-owning republics differed in their internal organization. There were aristocratic republics and democratic republics. In an aristocratic republic, only a small number of privileged persons took part in the elections. In a democratic republic, everybody took part, but everybody meant only the slave owners. That is, everybody except the slaves. This fundamental fact must be borne in mind because it throws more light than any other on the question of the state and clearly demonstrates the nature of the state. The state is a machine for the oppression of one class by another, a machine for holding in obedience to one class other subordinated classes. There are various forms of this machine. The slave-owning state could be a monarchy, an aristocratic republic, or even a democratic republic. In fact, the forms of government varied extremely, but their essence was always the same. The slaves enjoyed no rights and constituted an oppressed class. They were not regarded as human beings. We find the same thing in the feudal state. The change in the form of exploitation transformed the slave-owning state into the feudal state. This was of immense importance. In slave-owning society, the slave enjoyed no rights whatever and was not regarded as a human being. In feudal society, the peasant was bound to the soil. The chief distinguishing feature of serfdom was that the peasants, and at that time the peasants constituted the majority, the urban population was still very small, were considered bound to the land. This is the very basis of serfdom. The peasant might work a definite number of days for himself on the plot assigned to him by the landlord. On the other days, the peasant serf worked for his lord. The essence of class society remained. Society was based on class exploitation. Only the owners of the land could enjoy full rights. The peasants had no rights at all. In practice, their condition differed very little from the condition of slaves in the slave-owning state. Nevertheless, a wider road was opened for their emancipation, for the emancipation of the peasants, since the peasant serf was not regarded as the direct property of the lord. He could work part of the time on his own plot, could, so to speak, belong to himself to some extent, and with the wider opportunities for the development of exchange and trade relations, the feudal system steadily disintegrated, and the scope of emancipation of the peasantry steadily widened. Feudal society was always more complex than slave society. There was a greater development of trade and industry, which even in those days led to capitalism. In the Middle Ages, feudalism predominated, and here too the forms of state varied. Here too we find both the monarchy and the republic, although the latter was much more weakly expressed. But always the feudal lord was regarded as the only ruler. The peasant serfs were deprived of absolutely all political rights. Neither under slavery nor under the feudal system could a small minority of people dominate over the vast majority without coercion. History is full of the constant attempts of the oppressed classes to throw off oppression. The history of slavery contains records of wars of emancipation from slavery which lasted for decades. Incidentally, the name Spartacist, now adopted by the German communists, the only German party which is really fighting against the yoke of capitalism, was adopted by them because Spartacus was one of the most prominent heroes of one of the greatest revolts of slaves, which took place about 2,000 years ago. Comment, there's also a 1960 movie written by Dalton Trumbo and directed by Stanley Kubrick by the same name, Spartacus. It's highly recommended. Continuing, in the end, they were defeated, captured, and put to torture by the slave owners. Such civil wars mark the whole history of the existence of class society. I have just mentioned an example of the greatest of these civil wars in the epic of slavery. The whole epic of feudalism is likewise marked by constant uprisings of the peasants. For example, in Germany in the Middle Ages, the struggle between the two classes, the landlords and the serfs, assumed wide proportions and was transformed into a civil war of the peasants against the landowners. You are all familiar with similar examples of repeated uprisings of the peasants against the feudal landowners in Russia. Two comments here. One, of course there were certain other classes, but these were the main classes. This is important to remember because sometimes people will try to complicate or distort the Marxist view of class struggle and capitalism, which is between basically the big bourgeoisie and the proletariat, by saying, well, what about, this minor class or that minor class? Well, those minor classes are minor. In order to get anything done politically, they have to align either with the interests of the proletariat or with the big bourgeoisie. They can never really purely express their own. And it's not so much that they don't exist, it's that they are not weighing in on the class struggle and having that impact on history in the same way that the other great classes are having. Point 2, speaking of that impact on history, so Lenin mentions that there have been constant uprisings under the slave system of slaves, under feudalism of peasants, under capitalism of workers. Where Marxism comes into this is systematically studying this entire system, this entire history, and trying to refine the basic principles of liberation to what works, and attacking the root causes, not wasting time on things that, aren't really going to get at the root, aren't really going to make firm change, or are tinkering around with symptoms instead of the source of the problem. It is scientific socialism, Marxism is, because it scientifically analyzes all of this social conflict and makes a scientific theory of social change and revolution. Continuing. In order to maintain their rule and to preserve their power, the feudal lords had to have an apparatus by which they could unite under their subjugation a vast number of people and subordinate them to certain laws and regulations. And all these laws fundamentally amounted to one thing: the maintenance of the power of the lords over the peasant serfs. And this was the feudal state, which in Russia, for example, or in quite backward Asiatic countries where feudalism prevails to this day, differed in form. It was either a republic or a monarchy. When the state was a monarchy, the rule of one person was recognized. When it was a republic, the participation of the elected representatives of landowning society was in one degree or another recognized. This was in feudal society. Feudal society represented a division of classes under which the vast majority, the peasant serfs, were completely subjected to an insignificant minority, the owners of the land. The development of trade, the development of commodity exchange, led to the emergence of a new class, the capitalists. Capital took shape at the close of the Middle Ages when, after the discovery of America, world trade developed enormously, when the quantity of precious metals increased, when silver and gold became the medium of exchange, when money circulation made it possible for individuals to possess tremendous wealth. Silver and gold were recognized as wealth all over the world. The economic power of the landowning class declined, and the power of the new class, the representatives of capital, developed. The reconstruction of society was such that all citizens seemed to be equal. The old division into slave owners and slaves disappeared. All were regarded as equal before the law, irrespective of what capital each owned, whether they owned land as private property or were poor, who owned nothing but their labor power. All were equal before the law. The law protects everybody equally. It protects the property of those who have it from attack by the masses who, possessing no property, possessing nothing but their labor power, grow steadily impoverished and ruined, and become converted into proletarians. Such is capitalist society. I cannot dwell on it in detail. You will return to this when you come to discuss the program of the party. You will then hear a description of capitalist society. This society advanced against serfdom, against the old feudal system, under the slogan of liberty. But it was liberty for those who owned property. And when feudalism was shattered, which occurred at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, in Russia it occurred later than in other countries, in 1861, the feudal state was then superseded by the capitalist state, which proclaims liberty for the whole people as its slogan, which declares that it expresses the will of the whole people and denies that it is a class state. And here there developed a struggle between the socialists, who are fighting for the liberty of the whole people, and the capitalist state, a struggle which has led to the creation of the Soviet Socialist Republic and which is spreading all over the world. To understand the struggle that has been started against world capital, to understand the nature of the capitalist state, we must remember that when the capitalist state advanced against the feudal state, it entered the fight under the slogan of liberty. The abolition of feudalism meant liberty for the representatives of the capitalist state and served their purpose, inasmuch as serfdom was breaking down, and the peasants had acquired the opportunity of owning, as their full property, the land which they had purchased for compensation or in part by quit rent. This did not concern the state. It protected property irrespective of its origin because the state was founded on private property. The peasants became private owners in all the modern, civilized states. Even when the landowner surrendered part of his land to the peasant, the state protected private property, rewarding the landowner by compensation, by letting them take money for the land. The state, as it were, declared that it would fully preserve private property, and the state accorded it every support and protection. The state recognized the property rights of every merchant, industrialist, and manufacturer, and this society, based on private property, on the power of capital, on the complete subjection of the propertyless workers and laboring masses of the peasantry, proclaimed that its rule was based on liberty. Combating feudalism, it proclaimed freedom of property, and was particularly proud of the fact that the state had ceased, supposedly, to be a class state. Yet the state continued to be a machine which helped the capitalists to hold the poor peasants and the working class in subjection. But in outward appearance it was free. It proclaimed universal suffrage, and declared through its champions, preachers, scholars, and philosophers that it was not a class state. Even now, when the Soviet Socialist republics have begun to fight the state, they accuse us of violating liberty. Sound familiar today? Of building a state based on coercion, on the suppression of some by others, whereas they represent a popular, democratic state. And now, when the world socialist revolution has begun, and when the revolution has succeeded in some countries, when the fight against world capital has grown particularly acute, this question of the state has acquired the greatest importance and has become, one might say, the most burning one, the focus of all present-day political questions and political disputes. Whichever party we take in Russia, or in any of the more civilized countries, we find that nearly all political disputes, disagreements, and opinions now center around the conception of the state. Is the state in a capitalist country, in a democratic republic, especially one like Switzerland or the USA, in the freest democratic republics, an expression of the popular will, the sum total of the general decision of the people, the expression of the national will, and so forth? Or is the state a machine that enables the capitalists of those countries to maintain their power over the working class and the peasantry? That is the fundamental question around which all political disputes all over the world now center. What do they say about Bolshevism? The bourgeois press abuses the Bolsheviks. You will not find a single newspaper that does not repeat the hackneyed accusation that the Bolsheviks violate popular rule. If our Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, again, radlibs, sockdems, and populists, in their simplicity of heart, perhaps it is not simplicity, or perhaps it is the simplicity which the proverb says is worse than robbery, think that they have discovered and invented the accusation that the Bolsheviks have violated liberty and popular rule, they are ludicrously mistaken. Today, every one of the richest newspapers in the richest countries, which spend tens of millions on their distribution and disseminate bourgeois lies and imperialist policy in tens of millions of copies, every one of these newspapers repeats these basic arguments and accusations against Bolshevism, namely that the USA, Britain, and Switzerland are advanced states based on popular rule, whereas the Bolshevik Republic is a state of bandits in which liberty is unknown, and that the Bolsheviks have violated the idea of popular rule, and have even gone so far as to disperse the Constituent Assembly. These terrible accusations against the Bolsheviks are repeated all over the world. These accusations lead us directly to the question, what is the state? In order to understand these accusations, in order to study them and have a fully intelligent attitude towards them, and not to examine them on hearsay but with a firm opinion of our own, we must have a clear idea of what the state is. We have before us capitalist states of every kind, and all the theories in defense of them which were created before the war, this of course being World War I. In order to answer the question properly, we must critically examine all these theories and views. I have already advised you to turn for help to Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Comment, as of the time of this recording, this is not yet available at Socialism for All. It's a very long book, but there are other copies online as well as at Marxists.org. This book says that every state in which private ownership of the land and means of production exists, in which capital dominates, however democratic it may be, is a capitalist state, a machine used by the capitalists to keep the working class and the poor peasants in subjection, while universal suffrage, a constituent assembly, a parliament are merely a form, a sort of promissory note, which does not change the real state of affairs. The forms of domination of the state may vary. Capital manifests its power in one way where one form exists, and in another way where another form exists. But essentially, the power is in the hands of capital, whether there are voting qualifications or some other rights or not, or whether the republic is a democratic one or not. In fact, the more democratic it is, the cruder and more cynical is the rule of capitalism. One of the most democratic republics in the world is the United States of America, yet nowhere, and those who have been there since 1905 probably know it, is the power of capital, the power of a handful of multimillionaires over the whole of society, so crude and so openly corrupt as in America. Once capital exists, it dominates the whole of society, and no democratic republic, no franchise or right to vote can change its nature. Quick comment there, obviously listening to this in 2022, very little has changed. But why? It's been over a century. Because this is exactly what Lenin is saying. The state is a product of class society. That is the thing. It's not technology. It's not trends. It's not anything else. The state is there for the rule of one class over another. That is the primary thing. The form may change a little bit, but that is basically its purpose. Capitalism is based on very simple logic, private property, and the things that flow out of that. And again, the technology may change, but the fundamentals of the property relations do not. And that is what is really key here. So when we describe the United States in terms of how a handful of multimillionaires, of course, with inflation today, billionaires, over the whole of society is so crude and so openly corrupt, yeah, that hasn't changed at all. It's not going to change until capitalism is abolished. Continuing. The Democratic Republic and universal suffrage were an immense progressive advance as compared with feudalism. They've enabled the proletariat to achieve its present unity and solidarity, to form those firm and disciplined ranks which are waging a systematic struggle against capital. There was nothing even approximately resembling this among the peasant serfs, not to speak of the slaves. The slaves, as we know, revolted, rioted, started civil wars, but they could never create a class-conscious majority and parties to lead the struggle. They could not clearly realize what their aims were, and even in the most revolutionary moments of history, there were always pawns in the hands of the ruling classes. The bourgeois republic, parliament, universal suffrage, all represent great progress from the standpoint of the world development of society. Humanity moved towards capitalism, and it was capitalism alone which, thanks to urban culture, enabled the oppressed proletarian class to become conscious of itself, and to create the world working class movement. The millions of workers organized all over the world in parties, the socialist parties which are consciously leading the struggle of the masses. Without parliamentarism, without an electoral system, this development of the working class would have been impossible. That is why all these things have acquired such great importance in the eyes of the broad masses of people. That is why a radical change seems to be so difficult. It is not only the conscious hypocrites, scientists and priests that uphold and defend the bourgeois lie that the state is free and that its mission is to defend the interests of all. So also do a large number of people who sincerely adhere to the old prejudices and who cannot understand the transition from the old capitalist society to socialism. Not only people who are directly dependent on the bourgeoisie, not only those who live under the yoke of capital or who have been bribed by capital. There are a large number of all sorts of scientists, artists, priests, etc. in the service of capital. But even people who are simply under the sway of the prejudice of bourgeois liberty have taken up arms against Bolshevism all over the world, because when the Soviet Republic was founded, it rejected these bourgeois lies and openly declared, "You say your state is free," whereas in reality, as long as there is private property, your state, even if it is a democratic republic, is nothing but a machine used by the capitalists to suppress the workers. And the freer the state, the more clearly is this expressed. Examples of this are Switzerland in Europe and the United States in America. Nowhere does capital rule so cynically and ruthlessly, and nowhere is it so clearly apparent as in these countries, although they are democratic republics. no matter how prettily they are painted, and notwithstanding all the talk about labor democracy and the equality of all citizens. The fact is that in Switzerland and the United States, capital dominates, and every attempt of the workers to achieve the slightest real improvement in their condition is immediately met by civil war. There are fewer soldiers, a smaller standing army in these countries. Switzerland has a militia and every Swiss has a gun at home, while in America there was no standing army until quite recently. And so when there is a strike, the bourgeoisie arms, hires soldiery, and suppresses the strike. And nowhere is the suppression of the working class movement accompanied by such ruthless severity as in Switzerland and the USA. And nowhere does the influence of capital in parliament manifest itself as powerfully as in these countries. The power of capital is everything. The stock exchange is everything, while parliament and elections are marionettes, puppets. But the eyes of the workers are being opened more and more, and the idea of Soviet government is spreading farther and farther afield, especially after the bloody carnage we have just experienced, World War I. The necessity for a relentless war on the capitalists is becoming clearer and clearer to the working class. Whatever guise a republic may assume, however democratic it may be, if it is a bourgeois republic, if it retains private ownership of the land and factories, and if private capital keeps the whole of society in wage slavery, that is, if the republic does not carry out what is proclaimed in the program of our party and in the Soviet Constitution, then this state is a machine for the suppression of some people by others, and we shall place this machine in the hands of the class that is to overthrow the power of capital. We shall reject all the old prejudices about the state meaning universal equality, for that is a fraud. As long as there is exploitation, there cannot be equality. The landowner cannot be the equal of the worker, or the hungry person the equal of the full person. This machine called the state, before which people bowed in superstitious awe, believing the old tales that it means popular rule, tales which the proletariat declares to be a bourgeois lie. This machine the proletariat will smash. So far, we have deprived the capitalists of this machine and have taken it over. We shall use this machine, or bludgeon, to destroy all exploitation. And when the possibility of exploitation no longer exists anywhere in the world, when there are no longer owners of land and owners of factories, and when there is no longer a situation in which some gorge while others starve, only when the possibility of this no longer exists shall we consign this machine to the scrap heap. Then there will be no state and no exploitation. Such is the view of our Communist Party. I hope that we shall return to this subject in subsequent lectures, return to it again and again. And that's the end of the audiobook. So I made my comments at the beginning and throughout. I have really nothing to add. This was a great speech. I'd be applauding furiously if I saw Lenin deliver it in person. But alas, this is what we've got. So what do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, so really appreciate the patron support, as it has allowed me to spend much more time per month on creating S4A content than I would have been able to do without that support, so very much appreciated. Then, after the content has been produced and uploaded, engagement counts, so like it, share it, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, even if it's just thanks or good video. All of that helps to boost the channel in the YouTube algorithm. The channel has been steadily growing, which means that more and more people are able to stumble across it, have it recommended to them, and we need more and more people in the left to get up to speed on this stuff so that we can wage effective political struggle. So might seem like a little thing, but actually liking and subscribing and all that stuff does help. Every 1,000 more people who get exposed to this material, it's going to be a help to the movement. So thanks for that. It's also appreciated. It does matter. Then finally, don't forget to organize. As soon as you feel even slightly prepared, join a party or organization. If you are over the Democratic Party, which you should be, it is a non-reformable party that is controlled by capital, and you are not organizing with at least the Green Party, you are wasting time. Not getting organized does not do anyone any favors. You need to pick some left organization, party, whatever. Again, stay away from the Democrats, and if your organization ever considers endorsing Democrats, please fight against that from within the organization. But we need to build a movement of working class, anti-capitalist parties, organizations, unions, etc., that can coalesce in a coalition eventually to prosecute the class struggle and eventually abolish capitalism. These videos, this education can only take you part of the way. The rest is up to you. This is history that the working class has to write. So pick up a pen, so to speak, and get out there. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.